Flashes of memory.
Every day felt the same. The pressing crowds on the subway, the same coffee in my thermos, and the same conversations. Life was routine and the predictability was my only solace. Until the day it wasn't. It began as all days did, with my alarm's grating buzz. Groggily, I shut it off and followed the monotony of my morning routine. I left for work, and the city swallowed me whole, guiding me to the subway platform. The screech of the train and the murmur of conversations surrounded me. But today there was a growing feeling, like a song I couldn't shake. I walked into my office building, and Janet, our ever-smiling receptionist, chirped, "Late again, Alexander? Mr. Walters won't be happy." A wave of confusion washed over me. That was what she'd said yesterday. Trying not to think too much about it, I headed to my desk. Lunchtime rolled around, and to my astonishment, everyone started setting up for Ben's surprise birthday. My jaw dropped. We'd just celebrated it. Yesterday. Feeling a mix of confusion and panic, I approached Daniel, my colleague and friend. "Didn't we do this yesterday?" I whispered, trying not to sound as unhinged as I felt. He laughed, clapping me on the back. "Maybe you're getting old, or you're drinking too much after work. Every day's a party for you, huh?" My heart raced. The rest of the day went by in a blur. Every conversation, every comment, every sound was a mirror of yesterday. It was as if the universe was playing a cruel joke on me. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, my mind a whirlwind. I tried convincing myself it was just exhaustion, maybe stress. Tomorrow would be different. It had to be. But when I entered the office the next day, my stomach sank. Janet, with that same stain on her blouse, gave me her repeated warning about being late. I felt a rising dread. It was happening again. Desperate, I grabbed a random colleague. "What's today's date?" He looked puzzled. "It's April 7th, why?" But April 7th was yesterday. My mind screamed in horror. Days turned into a torturous loop. Every morning it was April 7th. No one else noticed. No one else remembered. It felt like a prison I couldn't escape. My once comforting routine now strangled me. Desperate, I tried changing things. I skipped work, shouted at strangers, tried talking, pleading with Janet. Nothing changed. The world was set on replay and only I was out of sync. Days, or maybe weeks later, in my despair, something different finally happened. As I slumped at my desk, lost in my thoughts, a whispered voice brought me back. "Wake up." I looked around and found one of my coworkers, Lydia, standing next to me, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "What did you just say?" I murmured, feeling my heart in my throat. She looked around nervously and leaned closer. "Wake up, Alexander!" I stared at her, disbelief mingling with hope. "You remember? You know what's happening?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Not here. Meet me after work." Hours felt like eons. As the sun began its descent, I found Lydia in a quiet corner of a nearby park. "I don't know how, but I remember," she began, her voice shaking. "I remember every repeated day, but I can't bear it any longer. I've tried telling others, but they don't listen." We talked for hours, sharing our experiences, our fears. But the more we talked, the more I realized the haunting truth. One evening, Lydia looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "You need to wake up, Alexander." "What do you mean? Why do you keep saying that?" "Because this isn't real. We're not real. You're somewhere else, trapped, and you need to find your way back." I felt like the earth was being pulled from under my feet. This has to be some nightmare. I just need to wake up and everything will be back to normal. Her voice became a whisper. "But what if normal isn't what you think it is? What if you're running from something so horrific that this loop is your escape?" The thought sent chills down my spine. Was this some elaborate purgatory? Days or maybe weeks went by. My desperation grew. I needed to break free. Lydia became my anchor, reminding me every day that I had to wake up. But how? Then one morning, a memory hit me. The subway, the screeching of brakes, screams, flashing police lights. The weight of something heavy in my hand and a trail of scarlet. Horror coursed through me. The memories became vivid. I was running. The weight of guilt and fear driving me. I'd done something terrible. The faces of my victims haunted me, their screams echoing in my ears. Lydia's words made sense. I was in a coma, my mind creating this loop to protect me from the monstrous reality of my actions. But I couldn't stay here forever. With newfound determination, I tried to force myself awake. Every day, I focused on the memories, the feelings, trying to reconnect with reality. And every day, Lydia whispered her plea. Wake up. One day it worked. The world around me crumbled, and I woke up to the blinding white of a hospital room. My body ached, and the weight of my sins bore down on me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the stern faces of police officers and the disappointed looks of my family. I was a murderer, trying to escape my crimes, and now I had to face the consequences. The irony was not lost on me. My mind's prison had been a kinder jail than the one that awaited me. I have always prided myself on being a good chess player. When I was a little younger, in my early teens, I gained quite a bit of notoriety as a wunderkind, reaching masters and punching well above my weight class in chess circles. I moved away from chess in my late teens, and just like every other muscle, if you do not stretch and flex it, you lose it. I might not be the master I once was. I still play blitz and rapid and enjoy the casual match. Definitely no tournaments for me, though. Speed chess in the park is arguably one of the most fantastic experiences one can experience. You never know who you meet, what sort of playstyle you will be going against, what experience level the player across from you has, if they're classically trained or not. The possibilities are endless. On top of this, you get to have a genuine human connection without technology, which in this day and age is such a rarity. I have made it a habit of, at least once a week, coming down to the park to play, at least for an hour or two, just because of how much enjoyment I get from playing one of my favorite childhood games with strangers, for nothing more than bragging rights. Yesterday wasn't any different. I made my way down to the park holding my portable wooden chess set and went down to the tables. Mondays were always hit or miss, either tons of people playing or nobody. On this particular Monday, it was unfortunately the latter. The only person at the tables was this elderly man that I had never seen before. I casually walked over to him and introduced myself. "Hey there, I'm Brian. Care for a game?" I said while extending my hand, my chess set tucked under my opposite arm. "Hello, Brian. Glad to play you," he said, shaking my hand and extending his arm, inviting me to sit across from him. "My pieces are yours." "Yours? You aren't ready for mine," the man said while grinning at me. That caught me off guard, but I decided to let it go. It's just a game after all. I set my pieces up, and he is. Just like that, the game was on. I was playing white and started my standard king's pawn opening. He countered with his, and I developed my pieces in the standard Spanish game. A student of theory, I see. The man grinned again. "You've been playing this game for a while, I can tell. Just not quite as long as I have," the man said while winking at me. "I've dabbled in my fair share of matches," I replied while moving my knight. Something about this man's demeanor unsettled me, yet I could not place it. It wasn't for another couple of moves that I realized that he wasn't looking at the board at all, just at me. "Brian, you said your name was?" the man asked, his gleaming eyes pointing daggers directly at mine. Yeah. I'm just now realizing you never gave me yours," I replied, my confidence beginning to falter. "I go by many names, but my friends call me Scratch." "Am I your friend?" We are old friends, actually, Brian. Did we meet back when I was playing tourneys on the national circuit? Something like that. He smiled again. I was rapidly becoming more and more unsettled, and it showed on the chessboard. My positioning was crumbling, and he began methodically advancing his pieces. What is this attack? I've never seen it before, I said, trying to change the topic. You can call it personally developed. Slow and deliberate, no matter how long it takes. He paused as he moved his bishop to take my rook. The pieces will fall. It is one of the absolutes of this game. I will not go down that easily, though, I replied, checking his king with my queen. No, you will not. Scratch chuckled while moving his king out of danger. You will live a long and fruitful life and die peacefully in your sleep next to your wife. My wife? I laughed as I replied, I'm incredibly single and don't have any prospects of a relationship. For now, yes, give it a few years. How can you be so sure that I will get married and die in my sleep? Let's just say I have it on good authority that you will make it into your 70s. I am not in the business of trusting strangers on a park bench I've just met while playing chess. I've already told you, we are old friends. Sir, I do not believe that I have met you before. We've met. It was the night you drowned, he said while capturing my queen. Check. When I was 10 years old, my family was having a bonfire, and I went into my backyard to grab another piece of firewood. I had tripped over the garden hose which was haphazardly laying next to our pool, and hit my head and fell in. Officially, I had been dead for 4 minutes. But my dad, who was a paramedic, managed to resituate me before going to the hospital. The thing is, nobody except close family knew about this. I didn't even tell my close friends. They only knew that I hit my head and had to go to the hospital. Who are you? Did you work in the hospital? I replied. Like I said, I'm an old friend. Checkmate, he said as he moved his queen. He was right. I missed the checkmate and moved to attack instead of defend. But who are you? I repeated, still dumbfounded. I think you know who I am, he said, winking again. But if you are death and you say that I am going to die of old age, why are we talking now? I asked flatly, still dumbfounded the words left my mouth. Because I am not here for you. I'm here for her, Scratch said, pointing at an old woman sitting underneath a tree. She wasn't ready to go quite yet, and I knew you'd be here, so I fancied a match. Why play me if you knew you were going to win? I always win, but I love a battle. After that, the man got up and walked over to the woman. I don't know when he left, but I waited. It was only 20 or so minutes before the ambulances had begun to roll up. I found out later she managed to call 911 with concerns of a heart attack before she passed. I've been at a loss for words the past day and thought that writing this out would help me process what had transpired. As I'm finishing this, I still feel uneasy, but I will leave you with this parting lesson. Be careful when playing chess with old men at the park. My daughter used to see me reading stories and ask me to read to her. That's when her obsession with horror began. I found a story that was tame and dumbed it down so she could understand it. I thought it would still scare her, but the whole time she had a huge smile on her face. So I kept reading to her, usually 1 story a day, but sometimes I'll dangle a second story as an incentive for her to behave. A lot of your posts get a little gruesome, so most of the time I'll add in Scooby-Doo and a few more hijinks and less bloody murder to make it a little more child-friendly so she is only slightly spooked, but still enthralled. When I got a new laptop for work, I wiped the memory. I made sure to uninstall all of the browsers too so she couldn't use the internet, just in case she figured out how to connect Wi-Fi. That way she could play games like Freddy Fish or Pajama Sam, and I don't have to worry about her going onto the internet and stumbling upon something she shouldn't. She started using the laptop to write her own short horror stories. Every time she finished a story, she would email me it by printing them out and putting them in an envelope she wrote a big E on and handing them to me. She would always beg me to drop whatever I was doing to read it. Whenever I finished, she would always ask if her story had scared me, but I never had the heart to tell her that her stories were more adorable than scary. They were mostly about princesses getting taken by bad guys, or kittens fighting off monsters, and almost all of her stories had Scooby-Doo in them. Like father, like daughter, I suppose. Even though I obviously wasn't spooked, I would always tell her that she scared me, and she would always respond the same way. No way. Daddies aren't scared of anything. Now I'm certain any parent out there can tell you that is a load of shit. We're afraid of so many things. I'm afraid of losing my job so I can't provide for my family, or something bad happening to my wife or daughter. I remember back when she was first born, it drove me crazy whenever my wife would turn her back on the cart when she was in it. I was paranoid that someone would snatch my little girl right out of the cart. After all, whenever a child gets kidnapped, they always say, "I only looked away for a minute." The day came when one of my daughter's stories actually did scare me. It's kind of hard to explain it, so I'll just post the story. It went like this. Sherry's boyfriend went out and bought some magical pixie dust. He gave the pixie dust to Sherry and told her it was sugar. He was lying to her. Sherry was so excited that she ate a whole bunch with her nose. Then she started dancing. Then she started twitching. Then she died. No one ever found out what Sherry's boyfriend did. The fact that someone died in one of her stories was off-putting enough, but to obviously reference a drug overdose was not a normal thing for a 7-year-old to write about. When I finished reading the story, my daughter was looking up at me with her big grin asking, "Did I scare you?" I tried asking her where she heard this story, but she insisted she made it up. She grabbed my arm and kept asking me if she scared me. For a first time since she started writing, I honestly told her yes. "No way. Daddies aren't scared of anything," she said, and she skipped off to go play. I showed the story to my wife and she looked at me with a scowl, scolding me for reading our daughter so many scary stories off of the internet. I told her that I'd never read her a story like this, and that I have never read her a story where someone died. I asked my wife if it was possible that our daughter had seen it on a TV show she left on. My wife said that she hadn't watched any adult shows without me in weeks. I was convinced that my daughter must have seen this story on TV, that my wife was just out of the room, or maybe someone at her school gave her the idea. I kept racking my brain trying to come up with an answer. But when she wrote another story a couple days later, and it was back to her usual subject matter, I decided to let it go. About a week later, my wife texted me a link to a news site. A young girl named Cheryl died of a heroin overdose. Apparently, she got the heroin from her boyfriend, who told her it was coke. The article said her death was being labeled as an accident and that her boyfriend wouldn't be charged at this time. It didn't take long for me to make the connection. Someone must have left the news on, and my daughter heard this story. It's possible that she didn't even know that the story was her inspiration. She just remembers an event. I thought about trying to talk to her about drugs and the story again. But she was her usual self. So if the story is just a story to her, I didn't want her to make a connection to some horrible real event. More stories came, all standard fare. I would tell her that these stories are much better and much scarier than that Sherry story. It seemed like we were moving past everything until she wrote another really scary story. Danny was bored, so he stole a car. Danny was a bad boy. He didn't realize that the car belonged to a bad man. When the bad man found Danny, he shot Danny in the head, then the bad man drove away. The story was worse than the first one. The somewhat childlike wording of the first story softened the blow and made it a bit easier to process. This story had no padding. It was there, in your face. Shot Danny in the head. I never thought I would hear those words from my little girl. My daughter was still just looking up at me with her big green eyes, waiting for me to say what I always said. I asked her where she heard this story, but just like she did with the Sherry story, she insisted she made it up. I told her that the story was mean and that she shouldn't write stories like this anymore. She argued with me, and I ended up grounding her from writing. The next day I had to work late. I was waiting for my partner to finish a bit that I needed, so I thought I would take a second to see if I could find anything about my daughter's story. If she heard the first one on the news, she probably heard this one too. A little bit of Googling turned up a story about a boy named Daniel who was found dead near the interstate. The police thought it was a mugging gone wrong. Two things stuck out to me. One, Daniel had previously served time in juvie for Grand Theft Auto, and two, he was shot in the head. I couldn't turn up any other stories with a victim named Danny, Dan, Daniel, or anything else that's similar. This had to have been the story she heard. The only problem was that the story was posted almost 24 hours after I read my daughter's story. That didn't make sense to me. I checked every news site I could find. They all said that Danny was killed the night after my daughter wrote the story about him. I went back and looked at the story about Sherry, and it was the same. They found Sherry dead 2 days after my daughter wrote that story. How did my daughter write a story so eerily similar to a real-world event before that event even happened? It had to have been a coincidence, right? I was quiet when I went home that night, and so was my daughter. My wife told me that my daughter was sick and asked me if I was feeling under the weather as well. I told her that I was, which wasn't technically a lie since I was feeling sick. I just don't think the pain in my stomach and the tightness in my chest had anything to do with the virus my daughter had. The next day at work was a fog for me, but I ended up getting out of work on time for once. When I got home, I noticed that my daughter's laptop was on the kitchen counter, and my wife seemed to be in a very bad mood. When I asked about the laptop, my wife told me that since our daughter was sick in bed, my wife gave her the laptop so she could pass the time, but my wife had to take the laptop from her, and she isn't allowed to write any more stories. I asked her why she was so on edge, even though the answer was obvious. My wife pulled the crumpled piece of paper out of the trash can and handed it to me. She wrote another story, and I completely understand why my wife didn't want her writing anymore. Even typing it here makes my chest tighten up like crazy. Daddy got mad. Daddy tied me and Mommy up downstairs in the basement. I'm fine. I'm hungry and thirsty. Daddy brought my t-ball bat and hit Mommy with it until she stopped moving. After Daddy left, Mommy made scary noises for a while. Mommy hasn't made any noise in a while, though. Daddy hasn't stopped crying since Mommy stopped moving. I hope Mommy and Daddy feel better. Thanks for listening to this Stories to the End. Every Wednesday and Sunday, Flashes of Memory publishes a new story.